Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a Building Accessible for All, Equity and Inclusion Principles that ensure participation and positive outcomes for everyone in the community. My name is Olonda Green, and I am the Community Engagement Manager at the North Carolina Rural Center and your moderator for today. This is the third of 4 webinars on the topic of rural resilience to natural disasters that we are holding during the month of October. Our session last week did a deep dive on practical strategies and proven practices that can make a difference in our communities. A recording of last week's session should have been shared with you via email on this past Monday. So we're excited about today's session of Building Accessible for All, which continues the theme of building to withstand the storms to come. Our theme today reinforces that preparing for coming storms of the future requires that we must today have inclusive, equitable participation in the planning process and local decision making. We like to again thank the sponsor of this program, the American Red Cross, for their generous support. And we want to encourage you again to fill out the evaluation after today's session to be entered in for a chance to win the American Red Cross Deluxe Personal Safety Emergency Pack. Next slide. So we have a few logistical notes for today. Upon entry, you all have been muted. And if you find yourself having audio difficulty, you may also use your phone for audio. Finally, make sure that you submit your questions to the panelists via the Q&A feature, and we will be taking questions at the end. So you can feel free to submit those questions at any point throughout the presentation today. Next slide. For those of you who use social media, we want you to stay engaged during today's webinar. We encourage you to comment and share information about what we're talking about using one of our social media handles. So you can see on the screen if you use Twitter, maybe you're on Instagram or Facebook. You can find our social media handles for the NC Rural Center as well as the American Red Cross. So we want to stay engaged and let everyone know what's going on today. Next slide. So I'm just going to run through the agenda. So right now we're doing our welcome, and I'm talking about some session logistics, and we're going to have our speakers, Mr. Jason Gray, talking about vulnerable populations in FEMA disaster designated counties, and Dr. John Cooper addressing equity and planning for resilience. We will then go to our question and answer, and we'll talk about the next session that's coming up on next week. So we have 2 amazing presenters today. We're so fortunate. Their full bios are on the registration page. So in the interest of time, we're not going to read all the way through those, but we are delighted to have with us Mr. Jason Gray, Senior Fellow for Research and Policy at the NC Rural Center, to give us a brief overview of socioeconomic pre-existing conditions that make inclusive planning so important. After Jason's presentation, we will have another presentation from Dr. John Cooper, Assistant Vice President for Public Partnership and Outreach at Texas A&M University, to share his unique experience and perspective on practices that bring the whole community into the decision-making process necessary for a truly resilient future. So at this time, we're going to turn it over to Mr. Jason Gray.
Thank you, Olonda. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this morning. The comments I want to give is to lay groundwork for Dr. Cooper's presentation. That we have vulnerable populations in North Carolina that are vulnerable from a socioeconomic perspective, and particularly in how they're affected by natural disasters. And so I think of this as sort of the chronic socioeconomic disaster that we have in North Carolina, and that it's a pre-existing condition, to borrow the phrase that is now in common currency with the pandemic, that the socioeconomic conditions are pre-existing conditions that make it especially difficult for recovering from acute natural disasters. So we have chronic, we have acute. Next slide, please. So the counties we see in blue here are the counties that were designated by FEMA as disaster counties from the 2016 Hurricane Matthew and the 2018 Hurricane Florence. Two significant hurricanes that had massive impact in North Carolina in just a little less than a 2-year period. So want to just review some socioeconomic conditions in these blue counties. Next slide, please. And so I'm using a little bit of a word cloud notion here. You know, word clouds where words get repeated in a presentation or across social media that where certain words are highlighted. So what I want to point out here is that in this disaster designated region, there are over 366,000 African Americans, 25% of the total African American population for the region whose incomes are below poverty, the federal designated poverty level. For Native Americans, it's 24,800, a smaller number, but again, a similar percentage, 26%. So bigger percentage, smaller number. For Hispanic and Latinx populations, it's 170,000 in poverty. And again, a quite high percentage of total Hispanic population. And for white folk, it's almost 400,000 people who are in poverty. It's a big number because our overall population is big. But as a percentage of total population, it's only 10%. So that's why that 10% is real tiny. So big number, very small percentage. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce a new way of thinking about this. And this is something that we commonly use at the Rural Center. The federal definition of poverty has been pretty static for a couple of generations. And everybody understands this. And many state and federal agencies define eligibility for programs up to 200% of poverty income. And the Census Bureau has data that allows income cohorts to be broken out above it and below poverty income. So what you see here is a map of the total percentage of total population whose incomes are below 150% of the poverty income. It's quite a wide distribution. 16% here in Wake County, and in some places in Eastern North Carolina, it's over 40%. Next slide, please. So I and folks from around the country often refer to this 150% of poverty income and less as asset poverty. Okay, the federal poverty line is defined by income, but for folks who are just above the poverty line, they're working, as are many people who are actually below the poverty line. But for those who are above the poverty line, they're working, they're getting paid, but they're not accumulating enough earnings in order to grow assets, to grow savings for education, grow savings for a new home, to have savings for emergency purposes. So I generally refer to this as asset poverty. Okay. So for this large region that has FEMA designation, it's 1.6 million people. That's 26% of the total population of the region. And of that 1.6 million, 1 million are below the poverty line. But then you have 650,000 people who are above it. You know, these are folks whose heads are just above water financially. Again, they're working, they've got earnings, but they're not accumulating savings by and large. So this is, I think, a better scope of the vulnerable population in this region. Okay, next slide, please. So far, I've defined vulnerability by incomes, by individuals. We think of it in terms of household data. think of families, but I'm a geographer at heart. So I think vulnerability is also a function of geography. So I want to take a different frame now, how we think about vulnerability and focus on our most distressed places. So the North Carolina Department of Commerce uses a tier classification system for the state's 100 counties. Most of the folks on this session who are from North Carolina will understand, will be familiar with this, based on a broad economic matrix, which is quite good. Department of Commerce staff ranks counties from 1 to 100. The 40 counties that are most economically distressed get classified as tier 1. The next 40 counties are tier 2, and then the 20 most prosperous counties in the state get designated as tier 3. Okay. This is a commonly seen ranking system. But there's a lot of movement between the top of tier 1 and the bottom of tier 2. And there's also some movement between the top of tier 2 and the bottom of tier 3. But the 25 counties that make up the bottom of tier 1, our most persistently distressed, economically distressed counties, they sort of get lost in this mix. They're generally the same counties. So let's take a look at them and put the last first and look at some data for these 25 counties. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is, again, the slide for the overall disaster designation counties. This is, I don't know how many counties total it is right offhand, but it's a big number of counties in the state. So let's overlay the 25 most economically distressed counties over top of that. Next slide. Okay, these are the counties in red. Okay, so what pops out at us for this? Of the 25 counties, 24 of them are in eastern North Carolina, and a few going over into Piedmont. Only one county way out there in the southwest, a county I dearly love, Graham County out in the mountains, is outside of the disaster designated areas. So this is important because we have not only low wealth populations, but we have concentrated poverty, concentrated underdevelopment, that's concentrated in geographies that are vulnerable to natural disasters. But this ranking is from an economic matrix. There's also a racial and ethnic overlay on top of this. Next slide, please. So of the 25 most economically distressed counties in North Carolina, 16 of them are majority minority counties. That is, the majority of their population is either African American, Native American, or Hispanic. 9 counties are majority white. But of those 9 counties, 8 of them have people of color populations. Again, African American, Hispanic, Native American. 8 of them have people of color populations of 40% or higher. That is, they're between 40 and 50%. So the counties in the East that are most economically vulnerable, there's a very strong racial and ethnic dimension to that. And because of their location in the East, because of low-lying areas, they take the hurricanes on the chin, as we've seen from Hurricane Matthew and Florence and many hurricanes prior to that. So let's look at some data from these 25 counties. Next slide, please. Again, as we've done before, using a little bit different sizes here to differentiate between numbers and percentages. African-American poverty rate of 29%, a little bit higher than it is for the overall disaster designation. Native Americans, 28%, Hispanic, 36%, and for whites, 13%. Again, you see this vast differential between white poverty and people of color poverty. And I could throw up slides and data for an hour for incomes, a variety of different ways and these same gaps would be present. Next slide, please. So here's again the subset of the 25 counties looking at the percentage of total population whose incomes are below 150% of poverty. And this is the asset poverty. Next slide. So what do we see with these counties? We have in these counties an estimated 448,000 people with incomes below 150% of poverty income. This is 36% of the total population. So if we remember from the much bigger FEMA disaster designated counties, it was 26%. So we have 36% in these 25 counties. 280,000 people or so below poverty income, and 167,000 between 100 and 150% of poverty income. Again, asset poverty, people who are working and unable to accumulate savings. Next slide. So what are the key takeaways I would take from this? First, socioeconomic underdevelopment by a wide range of metrics has profound racial and ethnic imbalances in North Carolina. This imbalance also has a geographic dimension. Economically distressed counties have limited fiscal resources to absorb and manage the impact of natural disasters. So what do we do about that? And that's where inclusive planning comes in. In communities with crippling pre-existing socioeconomic conditions, resilience practice must take place in recovery planning periods, but they will only be successful with a long-term commitment to mitigate the inequitable impacts of the coming storms. So what we do between storms after the recovery planning period ends, and we have to continue it for years to deal with the conditions that we face in order for us to be able to be more resilient and take on the coming storms. And with that, I'll conclude, turn it back to Alonda to introduce Dr. Cooper, and look forward to the listening and learning from Dr. Cooper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that awesome presentation. Don't forget, you can go ahead and put questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those after Dr. Cooper's presentation. At this time, we will have Dr. Cooper to present.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me, and Jason for laying that foundation for, I thought what you said was very helpful for understanding the socioeconomic vulnerability, or what scholars commonly refer to as social vulnerability, and I'll use that term going forward in my talk. So in my time, I'll provide some additional illumination on the topic, and particularly with regard to how we carry out, or how we act in accord with your third bullet. That is, how do we do planning during blue sky times and with intent. But for starters, though, I want to offer some additional historical context to go along with what you said about hurricanes Florence and Matthew. Listeners might recall, or may be aware, that this year has been 15 years since Hurricane Katrina. And what made Hurricane Katrina notable was that it was the first time that the plight of the poor, the people that Jason just talked about, the disadvantaged, were the impact of disasters was on full display in the 24-hour news channels. But I bet lots of people listening to this call will be surprised to hear that long before Hurricane Katrina, people who work in emergency management and people who study disasters were well aware of the disproportionate impact of disasters on certain segments of the population. Just in North Carolina alone, if you think back before Katrina, there was Hurricane Floyd in 1999. I think we had Bertha and Fran in the summer of 1996. And then there was on the East Coast, Hurricane Andrew that devastated the southern parts of Florida, so forth and so on, all the way back to the Great Mississippi Flood and the San Francisco earthquake around the turn of the last century. In fact, I'm not going to go into the Great Mississippi Flood, but I encourage people to go to the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History. There's lots of information and photos documenting what happened at the Great Mississippi Flood. I think there's also a recording of a song by the great blues singer Bessie Smith talking about floods in that time. I believe the song is called Backwater Blues. And I think there's a quote there that talks about how when there's thunder and lightning and the wind begins to blow, there's thousands of people that ain't got no place to go, right? And 100 years later, that statement still rings true. So anyway, I also want to be clear that when we're talking about social vulnerability, we're not saying that disasters discriminate. However, the consequences of years of discrimination and inequitable land use practices in our society have resulted in poor people being in circumstances that increase their vulnerability. Slide 1. Maybe the next slide, please. Again, socially vulnerable people in households tend to be concentrated in predictable spatial patterns based on household characteristics. They tend to face increased exposure to flooding and other hazards. They tend to vary in capacity to anticipate, prepare for, respond, survive and recover from disasters. Again, they're typically less prepared and suffer greater injury, loss, or death. That quote in the picture on the left there is from my friend and scholar, who's also a Tar Heel, Dr. Shannon Van Zandt, who leads the planning program here at Texas A&M. She likes to say that a good way to sum it up is to say low-income households live in low-quality homes in low-lying areas, right? That's a way to remember what we're talking about here. Next slide. So what can we do to address social vulnerability in rural communities? And to that, I say planning matters. I'm a planner by training. My PhD is from the Department of City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill, and I believe in planning. And last week, Dr. Whitehead talked a lot about the value of planning and the myriad of different types of plans that a community can develop as part of an overall resilient strategy. And I won't go back over that. I encourage you to go back and watch her talk, but I want to offer a few lessons that I've learned from research and practice that illustrate the consequences of not planning for rural communities. And some of this will validate what Dr. Whitehead said. First, the return on investment for pre-disaster planning is higher than the return on investment for relief and recovery. All right, this is a fact, a number that has been verified over and over again from a number of different sources. I believe the last one I read was from the National Institute of Building Sciences, and their number was for every dollar you spend on pre-disaster planning, it's worth at least $6 on relief and recovery, right? The other true fact is, reality is that it's much harder to be efficient, thoughtful, mindful, and effective in the midst of chaos. So it's best done in advance. All right. Traditionally, emergency managers, people in the practice talk about the 4 phases of emergency management. There's mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. But if you spend any time with professional emergency managers, they'll tell you that there's a 5th phase. So there's mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, and finger pointing, right? And so if you want to avoid that, it's best to be thinking about some of these things in advance so you're not caught off guard, all right? Second point, rural places are the last to receive help from state and federal agencies. The truth is, there's just more damage, more people, more of a return on investment, if you will, for driving resources to places where there are more people. And so if you have a plan in place, there's a chance you might be able to expedite assistance to your community. In fact, there are some federal assistance that requires that you have a plan before you can receive it. So at least you might have the opportunity of moving ahead of the places that don't have plans. Related to that, my third point is that plans that address equity could attract additional external funding to address equity issues that predated disasters. The truth is there's going to be, typically after disasters, there's lots of federal and philanthropic money, for example, that comes available to places. And the places that have plans in place will be better able to show that they have plans for receiving and managing the money without triggering an IRS investigation, right? In fact, after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, they started calling it St. Andrew for all of the resources that came into the place that allowed them to address some of the equity issues that predated the disaster, all right? And there may even be money raised on your behalf to be spent in the place that would go to outside organizations. If you have a plan, let me be clear. If you have a plan, it's more likely that money will find you, in my experience, right? And if you're going after grants, if you have a plan, it's much easier to cut and paste strategies, plans, and put them directly into grant applications to make the expedited funding easier. On, let's see, one more thing on plans. I made a note here. Actually, Congress annually appropriates money for pre-disaster planning, and they make it available through a number of agencies from FEMA, the National Resource Conservation Service, EPA, and others. In fact, I made a note 2 weeks ago, FEMA opened the application period for a new initiative called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. It's called the BRIC program. And you can Google that and find out more about it. But it will distribute upwards of $500 million to states, localities, and tribal governments for planning. And what I hear is that they're keenly aware of the need for planning resources in rural communities and other locales with limited capacity. So now to my last point, and this is a recurring theme. I think I heard Dr. Whitehead say this, and I've often said it myself, and that is a community is only as resilient as its most vulnerable citizens. Again, we know from years of research and practice that some folks suffer disproportionately due to the impacts of disaster. These are people, again, who are least able to prepare for, survive and recover from disasters. They have no place else to go. They rely on the goodness of other folks as a safety net. And this is the one thing, at least in my experience, there may be other things, but this is the one thing that is consistent in every disaster, be it tornado, hurricane, fire, chemical explosion, heat wave, pandemic. You can predict that the most socially vulnerable folks are the ones who are going to need the most help. They're the ones who are going to have the hardest time dealing with physical and mental trauma that comes from a disaster. So the fact that they are left behind, or that they are left to fend for themselves after every disaster, in my view, is shameful. Right? So, but I want to just digress from that. Next slide. So now, before I move on, I want to clarify that when people are socially vulnerable, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not resilient. So this is an image from Hurricane Katrina. Is one of my favorite images, and it was introduced to me by someone who was using it to show that when you initially look at the image, you think, okay, the caption is accurate. There's some kind of tragedy going on here, but if you take some time to think about it, there might be an alternative way of describing what's going on here. You might think of the ladies in this picture as having some strong survival instincts, right? Or they might be have some remarkable improvisational skills, right? And so when we talk about increasing resilience, what we're talking about is finding ways to tap into the survival and adaptation instincts of every individual and household in a community. So I'll come back to that point, but right now I want to deal with what must be, I think, a burning question for a lot of listeners. Next slide. And that is, if we know about the disproportionate impacts of disasters, if we've known about it for so long, why hasn't there been more attention to it? And this was also a question that members of the Congressional Black Caucus were asking after Hurricane Floyd damaged parts of eastern North Carolina in 1999. You'll recall, some of you, at least folks in North Carolina might recall, that President Clinton set up the commission to rebuild Princeville after Hurricane Floyd, and he tapped Representative Eva Clayton to lead that effort. I still have, somewhere on my desk, still have my copy of the Princeville Recovery Plan that we developed in that process. And they weren't able to, at the same time, they were trying to also raise money to do a study of, to better understand the barriers to increase disaster awareness and preparedness among disadvantaged populations. And they weren't able to get that money. And that was mostly due to timing. You'll recall also that we had a presidential election in 2011. And then the next year we had the attacks on 9/11. And that shifted our nation's focus away from mitigating the threats from environmental hazards to more so about mitigating threats to terrorist events. In any case, the Congressional Black Caucus was able to get money to do that study after Hurricane Isabel made landfall on the coast of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, I believe, in 2003. And I was on the team that carried out that research for that. But anyway, I promised Jason that I wouldn't get down any rabbit holes, so I need to come back from that. Anyway, the other thing that was happening in 2003 is I was finishing a dissertation focusing on the extent to which disaster plans account for equity in the process. And I looked at a national sample of community rating systems plans, CRS, and the CRS. CRS is an incentive program under the National Flood Insurance Program that offers rebates to communities that take action to mitigate hazards. They offer, discounts on flood insurance rates. And so, in one type of equity I was looking for in particular was something called procedural equity. That is, to what extent do planners engage socially vulnerable populations in the process of developing the plan? To what extent are they trying to understand the circumstances faced by socially vulnerable populations and the most appropriate strategies for dealing with issues that those populations face? And I concluded that even when emergency managers believe in the value of inclusive planning, it was not something that they were skilled in doing, right? Most emergency managers are trained in top-down command and control type models of leadership. And that's not what's required in an effort to enhance resiliency. You need more of a humanitarian approach. That's not to say that they were against it necessarily, but that they weren't trained in how to do it. And so about 7 years after that, I was on a team that did another study. This time we looked at disaster recovery plans. And so the next couple of slides, I'm about to share with you the results of that plan to illustrate that we still have a lot of room for improvement. So in that study, we evaluated 87 county and municipal recovery plans from states in the Gulf and Atlantic states. We surveyed emergency managers and the planners in each jurisdiction about their efforts to engage the public in the plan. We did some household residents. In particular, we did one with some folks in New Hanover County. And then we did some key informant interviews. Next slide. And so here are we also did some content analysis of the plans to see the extent to which they addressed equity. And these are the results of the content analysis. So we found that standalone community-wide recovery plans are the most effective at building local commitment for recovery planning. Oftentimes we know from research and practice that there's not much of a constituency for recovery planning. So, but standalone recovery plans helped address that. The goals in the plans were mostly restorative rather than transformative, which basically means that they were always aspiring to build back to the status quo. When I think the case that Jason and I want to make is that the status quo in a lot of instances is unacceptable, right? There are a lot of conditions that we want to address that were problems before disasters, and we want to make a better situation after the disaster. Planning lacks coordination with nonprofits. In North Carolina, there's a group called Inclusive Planning for Disaster Recovery, I believe. And what we're saying is that there's not enough of coordination between the people responsible for developing the plan and the people on the nonprofit side who work day to day with socially vulnerable populations. There are lots of VOAD groups. VOAD stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. So we want more communication and coordination back and forth between the formal responders and the people working at nonprofits who are great at the long-term recovery piece. Again, public planning is often limited, right? That's an ongoing problem. Next slide. So when we talked to emergency managers, they had a lot of concerns. They were concerned that when you try to engage the public, that the process might be dominated by special interests, right? Whereas in my experience, if you're intentional about being inclusive, you can minimize the kind of the influence of special interests. It does not guarantee representation, they said. And I would say, again, if you're intentional about it, then you can make sure that you are tapping all perspectives represented in the community. Okay, the public lacks expertise to contribute. In my experience, when you give lay people access to technical assistance, they can digest, absorb, and make wise decisions based on technical data. Okay, failure undermines trust in authorities. In my experience, I think when emergency managers are transparent and open and inclusive, that only builds trust with their constituencies. Could delay completion. Now, there's some truth to that. It could make the process slower in the beginning, but on the back end, you go much faster, and I think you have a much greater buy-in from your constituents when you increase public participation. Increases the cost of planning. Again, you know, multiple studies have shown that when you take steps to do planning before a disaster, and when you involve the public, when it's an inclusive process, in the end, that will lead to lower cost overall, right? That was a much greater return on investment. Next slide. So when we talk to people in households, we found out that a lot of them, well, very few participated in the recovery process. A majority of them felt that their engagement would improve the plan, right? And in my experience, I believe that to be true. Their top reason for not participating, they just weren't invited, right? And they didn't know that they could, okay? Some vulnerable populations were less aware of the recovery plan than others, right? And so after the plans are completed, the people who need to know, people who most need to know what's in the plan and how to act in accord with the plan are unaware with it, right? And so that's an issue that we need to address. Ongoing issue we need to address. Next slide. All right, so some kind of success factors that we took away from this effort. One, planning is most successful when planners actively engage residents. The engagement of the most vulnerable is necessary to ensure their conditions, concerns, capacities, and choices. In other words, equity are accounted for in the planning documents. And last one is that dedicated staffers skilled in the design and facilitation of inclusive programs are essential to increasing resilience or coming up with plans designed to increase resilience. Now, I know that that last point, when we're talking about rural places, is going to be a challenge because rural places often don't have the resources to keep full-time planners on staff. And I know that the people that you have on staff oftentimes wear multiple hats. So in the time I have left, I want to talk some about what you might do to get some additional capacity to do this work. First, I want to talk a little bit about my program. Next slide. So in addition to being the Assistant Vice President for Public Partnership and Outreach, I'm also a professor of the practice in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Texas A&M, and I direct this program called Texas Target Cities. This is a high impact service learning program within the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning that provides, I'll get into the benefits later, but we typically work with places that have a population less than 15,000, ones that don't have professional planners on staff, and they may not have the resources to hire consultants, not satisfied with the status quo. We tend to only go to places by invitation. And if we're invited to a place, that usually means that they have come to the understanding that the path that they're on is not sustainable, it's not resilient for everyone, and they want to do things in a different way. And so we're happy to work with places like that. And it usually means that those places are not in a hurry. Because I'm working with faculty and students, we usually have to work in accord with our semester timelines. But I warn, and I shouldn't say I warn, I let my students and faculty partners know that community problems don't take spring breaks, right? They don't have a Christmas vacation. They don't have a summer vacation. So we are bound by semester schedules, but we try to do our best to not have any kind of lapses in the work, and we want to be sure that we carry it forward to completion. The benefits from our community partners, they get a facilitated process, they get data and strategies tailored to the local context, grounded into their context. We also are respectful of the indigenous data that is in places. We recognize that as experts, we bring some information to the table, but the people that we're partnering with also have expertise by virtue of having lived in a place, and they know something about what will work in a place. And so we try to combine all of that together before we decide, okay, what else do we need to know and what's the most appropriate response for these places. They get licensed professionals. The people on my team are certified by the American Institute of Certified Planners and floodplain managers. So these are they're experts in their work, subject matter experts. They get access to other system resources, other universities, other colleges, other departments in the program. And they get a high quality planning document. That image to the right, the Liberty County plan, is a plan that we did for a rural county in Southeast Texas between Houston and Beaumont. And that plan won a national award for the American Planning Association. So it's exemplary work that is provided through a partnership with Texas A&M University. Next slide. And just a little about my process. I'm going to speed up. I'm mindful of the time here, but the process we use is not unlike any typical planning process. We didn't invent anything. This is not anything new. You'll recognize it. We try to organize people, bring them together. We provide them with information. We come up with goals and a vision. We prioritize strategy, and then we go about the work of implementing the plan. That quote to the left is one that I use in my classroom to teach my students that the work of organizing a team, being inclusive, and finding people who are energized to carry out the work is critical. If you don't get that right at the beginning, then you're setting yourself up for some disappointment. Next slide. This is something I learned from NBC. Before I came back to Texas A&M, I spent 9 years at NBC based in Durham, North Carolina. That's where I learned how to do community building work. And in short, we try in every place we work to build a team of about 12 to 15 people with some movers and shakers on one end, some civic leaders, pastors and nonprofits, et cetera, and some folks who are moved and shaken on the back end. Okay, I don't think I only have like one or two more slides. Okay, yeah, just when we frame the conversation, when we're talking in our meetings, the next slide is, next slide. Yeah, these are the kind of the topics that we're getting into: the conditions, the concerns, the capacities, and the choices, right? These are the topics we want to get into. That picture in the top right is from some work I did in Hertford County. That place was very special to me. The guy, African-American guy on the right, didn't get a chance to finish the process. He died before we were able to finish, but the work in Hertford County taught me a lot about indigenous knowledge. I'll say some more about that story later, if someone's interested. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to provide some additional resources for the folks in North Carolina. The people I named here aren't the only ones who are doing work in North Carolina. I know, for example, that there are people at Duke and maybe other universities, but these are people that I have known for a long time and that I trust. At North Carolina A&T, there's Michelle Ely. She's an extension agent. She's also a representative of the Extension Disaster Education Network. So Texas A&M is a land-grant university. I know North Carolina State is a land-grant university, so is A&T. At land-grant universities, they have this network of extension professionals who are available to help communities think about and plan for resilience. Michelle Ely is my point of contact for EDEN, the Extension Disaster Education Network. At East Carolina, there's Jamie Cruz at the Center for Natural Hazards. At North Carolina State, there's Dr. Gavin Smith, who's an expert on community recovery. He's written a book about it. He's invited all over the world to speak about his work and what he knows about recovery planning. And he's right there in Raleigh at North Carolina State. At UNC Chapel Hill, there's Phil Burke. Phil Burke was my mentor. He was also a mentor to Gavin Smith, also someone who is internationally renowned for his knowledge and runs the Center for Resilient Communities and Environment at UNC Chapel Hill. He's also the lead author on the document, the Plan and Integration for Resilience Scorecard book that you see in the image to the right. That is a tool that allows communities to take a look at their inventory of plans, all the plans that are in effect in their jurisdiction, and to review them to see to what extent they are complementary or in conflict with each other. And so there's a link for this. I think Jason's going to make this information available. But Philbrook, I'm sure if you reach out to him, he'd love to talk to you. And if he can't help you, he can tell you who else that you might reach out to. So I think that's, okay, key points, right? Again, the impact of disasters is exacerbated by socioeconomic factors. I think Jason said that, Dr. Whitehead before said that, and I'm telling you that this is the one thing I know to be true, if I don't know anything else. Also, communities can enhance resilience with the design and execution of inclusive pre-disaster programs. We need more commitment and competency, I think, in this regard. Again, there's still not as much of a constituency for resilience planning as we need in order to make this happen. But I think we need to work on that. I mean, I was going to say something, but it's going to probably sound like I'm picking on emergency managers. I don't want to do that. I was an emergency manager. I spent some time working with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. I know it can be a tough job. I know it can be a thankless job, but I do think we need to increase our level of professionalism in the field. Last point is that communities lacking planning expertise should try connecting with universities or other programs for technical assistance.
Okay, well, that concludes Dr. Cooper's presentation. Thank you so much for all of those nuggets and so much insight. So we did have some questions coming into the Q&A while you were presenting. So we're going to jump right in to those. If you do have a question, go ahead and feel free and you can begin typing at this time. First, I'll start with a comment by Holly Miller. She says, the current FEMA BRIC cycle requires a hazard mitigation plan, partnerships, community lifelines, and integration of nature-based solutions. Also, the North Carolina Department of Public Safety Emergency Management has already requested potential sub-applicants to submit a letter of interest that was due on October 9th. So these applicants will move forward in the application process for both the state and national competition for funds. So that's good to know. The next question is coming from an anonymous attendee, and they're asking, is there any data on voting rates in the 25 most distressed counties population? Could there be a correlation between representation and disaster recovery?
I'll just say that yes, there is voter participation data available. I can't put my finger on the state agency in North Carolina that has that data, but it is available, and I think it's a very good question because it's a fairly good proxy on civic engagement. For example, I mean, everything we're hearing now is that election turnout is quite high for the presidential election. Okay, people feel invested in outcomes, but unless we have an acute situation going on, voting participation tends to go down. But it is a sign of long-term engagement on the part of the population. I'll also add that in some of those 25 counties, there is a significant and growing Hispanic population. Data I've seen from Carolina demographics suggests that approximately 60% of the Hispanic population in North Carolina are American citizens. So that means 40% that's not, but they are residents and they may well be long-term residents, and their cares and concerns are also legitimate cares and concerns. So it's not only a question of civic participation in the voting process, but it's the engagement dynamics and the engagement process for making sure the needs of those who are not citizens, but who are long-term residents are also being met.
Thank you for that response. We have another question. It says, where do you see the emergency management / disaster planning field going in the next 10 years or 20 years?
I assume that question is for me. And I will say that I hope that it is going in a direction where there is more professionalism. And this is not just me. The director of the Texas Division of Emergency Management talks a lot about the need for more professionalism in the field. He will tell you that you need to have a medical degree to practice medicine. You need to have a law degree to practice law in emergency management. There are certifications. You can go to the Emergency Management Institute at Emmitsburg in Maryland, and you can get all kinds of certifications, but there's not really a degree, a high-level professional degree. There are emergency management programs, don't get me wrong, and a lot of those popped up after Hurricane Katrina. So I think it's moving in that direction, and I do appreciate that. What I would like to see more of is more training on the humanitarian kind of skills required in the job, right? The things that I talked about, the ability to connect with diverse populations, the ability to understand, listen, and respond to the needs of people who are on the bottommost rung in communities, and to think about ways to account for the conditions of those people in official planning documents. I think I'd like to see more diversity in the field. Race and gender. I think for a long time, I could go to meetings and I might be the only one in the room. There are a lot of times when I was the only Black person and the youngest person in the room. And so I see that changing. I see a lot more gender diversity, and I'm working with colleagues who are doing their part to increase the representation of women in the field. I think that's a trend that I'd like to see continue, so that there are more people representing the communities that Jason and I talked about in the field, who understand the context and know that the people who need the most help are the people that they care about. They come from and care about, I should say.
Okay, awesome. We have another question. It says, do disaster planners ever provide research to inform policymakers to address spatial disparities, such as lower socioeconomic folks living in flood-prone areas, and how can we prevent spatial disparities in the first place?
Yeah, researchers do that. In fact, I didn't, I've been a co-author on books with titles like Planning for Community Resilience that policymakers have used as a reference. There was another book that some colleagues and I worked on that I don't have sitting in front of me, but I'm happy to share links. So yes, planners and researchers do that work. They're not often involved directly in the advocacy because they have to maintain some objectivity, right? And then there was a second part of the question. Remind me of what that was.
How can we prevent spatial disparities in the first place?
Oh, yeah. So that's a very complicated question. I think the simple answer is we need to do a better job of planning, taking into account where we place housing and the quality of housing, right? And there are opportunities to do a better job of that after disasters, when oftentimes the slate is wiped clean. So you're starting from scratch, and so you can say, okay, we've learned from experience, and we don't want to put housing in that part of town, or this kind of housing in that part of town. And if we have to do it, we want to make sure that it's elevated or somehow mitigated to the extent that we're reducing the likelihood that the disaster would be as severe and the damages will be as severe the next time.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as I suggested in my comments, this is a long-term challenge in the South, where there is a long history of racial oppression and discrimination. But there's also good examples of getting better. And we always have to understand that our communities cannot thrive economically or socially if we're not creating a culture where everyone's potential is important. I think there is a huge role for the faith community to reemphasize that the challenges we face are just not how-to problems, there are why to problems as well of how do we build a community where the value of human life is truly valued. And that reflects in our budgets. It's reflected in our planning decisions. It's reflected in not seeing people as other. It's reflected in seeing ourselves and our fate, having a shared fate with everybody in our communities. When we do better at that, we're just going to stop putting people in vulnerable, at-risk situations of living in substandard housing in low-lying areas and vulnerable to the storms that will come.
Yeah, and I just want to add, Jason, thank you for that. One of the things that makes it complex is that, you know, because of our history of this particular relates to the South, but it's also true in places of North where Black folks and people of color and poor folks have been relegated to the parts of town where the land is cheap, right, and housing quality is low. But we're there now, right? You think about the story of Princeville. That town was literally founded on the banks of the Tar River. And I believe the story was where newly freed slaves had gone to seek the shelter of a Union encampment, and they built a town there. And it's been there since 1865 or whenever it was founded. They have roots there. They have ties there, right? And and in some places, when we're talking about poor folks, it's all that they have, right? The land that they inherited from their grandfather's grandfather. That's true in my case, right? My mother grew up in a house that was built by my grandfather's grandfather. And we don't want to let that go easily. And so you have to navigate some of those issues. But there are success stories. I think I talked about Dr. Gavin Smith. He last worked in Princeville after Matthew. And I believe in Princeville, they decided to move parts of the town to higher ground. So, I mean, there are examples out there of what you could do it, but you have to take into consideration all kinds of cultural and other considerations.
Okay. Well, the questions are coming in. We have another one that says, I work with nonprofits, community organizations in Eastern North Carolina that are comprised of large, diverse populations and focus on providing services to our underserved populations and involved in disaster planning, mitigation, and recovery. In your research, did you identify that there are no CERT teams east of I-95? What do you attribute this to? These communities want to have some capability of self-sufficiency involving their own populations. You're muted, Dr. Cooper.
Gotcha. We didn't look into CERT programs. CERT stands for Community Emergency Response Teams. This is a program, I think, supported by FEMA that trains citizens on emergency management. And so, and I encourage communities to develop CERT programs, but we haven't looked at the spread of CERT programs. To the question of why they don't exist, someone ought to look into that. But and I'm not prepared today to say that there's anything nefarious in that. I do encourage communities to develop them, but CERT programs, I think, might be limited in their focus, right? And so there's emergency response in the title. So I think it might be mostly focused on emergency response. I'm getting out there. People who are experts in this or people who work at FEMA will correct me, and I'm open to correction. But I think when we're talking about a broader resilience strategy, it is more than CERT. I don't know if CERT is limited to what they can do, though.
Okay. All right, we have a comment and question from Dr. Jess Whitehead. She says, as the state builds a North Carolina Resilient Communities program over the next 6 months in partnership with Rule Center, we have an opportunity to operationalize some of what you've talked about for resilience planning through a resilience guidebook and direct technical assistance for resilience planning. But my team is conscious that we come to the table from a state agency, and the kind of collaborative and inclusive approach we want to help create is new for the state. What are your top recommendations for approaching program design to better serve rural areas as we structure these efforts?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, let me respond to that if I may. One, we do have this active partnership that is emerging that's quite exciting with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience. And Dr. Whitehead's question is a good one, because going back to again, these 25 counties that are most economically distressed. Okay, these are counties that generally don't have planning staffs. They're just offering the bare services. So the broader rural development question, I always ask about rural areas generally, but for low wealth regions in particular, is that how do we build the capacity through some regional economy of scale to do the work? Okay, not every county is going to have that kind of expertise to be able to do the work, but we can look at regional solutions. In North Carolina, we have 16 regional councils of government. Their regions are generally 4 to 7 to 8 counties. I am a big proponent generally that we have got to make major investments to build the capacity at a regional scale, whether it's through these COGs or through similar regional organizations, to do the work. So I think the program design element is both for disaster recovery and building resilience, is the same answer to a broad range of rural development issues, which is how do we build capacity at regional scale to make things happen? These counties by themselves are not going to be able to move the needle. They've got to be networked together to build peer capacity, and we've got to figure out ways to aggregate capacity to see that the work is done. John, you have anything to add on that?
No, I won't disagree with anything you said. I'll only, I want to encourage the community-based organizations to connect with that. One of the negative outcomes of the response to Hurricane Katrina was that there were nonprofits who felt like they couldn't rely on government partners to do the work. And I say to that, you have to take in mind that the government partners, the counties, I think in North Carolina, counties are responsible for emergency management. They are legally responsible for emergency management. And there are things that the government can do, and then there are things that community partners, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations can do. And we are better together. So I just want to encourage community-based organizations to tap into what you're doing and to be open to growing in that way, contributing to building the collective capacity.
Okay, Dr. Cooper, we have a question for you. It says, could you speak more to the ways you have been able to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the planning process, specific examples or frameworks in which to think about?
I think, you know, I'm reminded of a story, and forgive me if you've heard me speak and heard me say the story before, but I was once giving a presentation. So in the emergency preparedness demonstration, we worked in 8 states along the Atlantic seaboard. And one of those states was West Virginia. And I remember driving over to West Virginia, into a rural part of West Virginia, and giving a presentation on the what I call the state of the community. I was presenting some baseline data on the state of the community. And I got to the section where I talked about the demographics of the place, and the data that I was using came from the census. And I was talking about the percent of African-American population in this place, and the number was less than a percentage. And I said it was something like 0.7% or something like that. And before I can move on, someone raised their hand and said, no, that family moved, right? And so the way I do it is I want to be mindful, again, that there are some things I know by virtue of the fact that I've been doing this for 25 years that I bring to the table. But then there are other things that people know by virtue of the fact that they've lived in a place their whole lives that might not be accounted for in formal sources of data. I can remember working in Hereford County, and we were talking about the different county roads, and not all of those county roads were on the map, right? And there were some bits of information about flood risk, levels of flood risk. And we found out things that we didn't know that we couldn't get from formal sources. And so whenever I'm working in a place, the first thing I want to do is present the information that I have gathered from formal sources. And then I want to ask people in the community, does this make sense, but based on what you know about this place? If not, tell me what you know about this place. Let's reconcile what I know with what you know, and then let's use that as our baseline. And from there, we talk about, okay, what else do we need to know? And how do we interpret new information? And how do we use it to inform the decisions we make about what to do about it? How do we come to some shared understanding?
Okay, we have another question that says, what role does trauma-informed care and services currently play or should play in disaster recovery? And are there any examples where this is happening happening well nationally?
For me, that is beyond my scope of expertise. I do know, I talked about kind of mental trauma in my talk, physical and mental trauma. I do think the mental trauma is often kind of overlooked. I don't think there's enough attention paid to that. But I defer to my friends in public health. There's one in particular, Dr. Jen Horney, who used to, when she was at North Carolina, she ran the Center for Public Health Preparedness. I think she's up at, well, I know she's up at the University of Delaware right now. But for questions like that, I usually defer to folks like her.
That makes sense.
That's a really, really great question. And I just want to emphasize for participants that next week, our session will focus on building resilient leaders, and we'll be featuring a panel of 3 leaders, and it'll be moderated by the Center's Director of Leadership, Bronwyn Lucas, that the emotional and psychic toll that especially repeated natural disasters has on rural leaders is a significant issue. And so we want to be able to shed a little bit of light on that. So thanks for asking that.
Okay. We have another question. It's a comment and a question. Expecting poor communities to improve or increase their capacity in emergency management based upon current county budgeting process is like asking schools in low tax-based communities to improve their education programs. Do you have a state in mind that implemented budget reform to resolve these inequities? And if so, where?
I want to be sure, is that a question for me or for Jason?
I think it's a question for you. You have more interstate exposure than I do on this issue.
I'm going to say this. I don't disagree or take offense to the comment. In fact, I think I called it out. I think I said that there's a lack of a constituency for resilience planning. And the truth is, too often we don't think it'll happen, or if it happens, we don't think it'll happen to us. But what I'm saying is the consequences of that are far more severe on socially vulnerable populations. And I'm saying that it ought to be elevated in our list of priorities and things that we work on. That said, everywhere I go, it's not a priority. Usually when budgets get cut, the Office of Emergency Management or Office of Emergency Management Programs are some of the first to get cut, all right? And I also talked about how, in addition to the 4 regular phases of emergency management, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, there's also finger pointing. The finger pointing is a result that we didn't prioritize these issues before disasters. So I think the person that's asking the question, I'm on the same page with them. I hope that we can figure out models. Again, there are resources available from FEMA and other places to do this. We just need to be able to distribute those resources more, get them more out there, make people aware that this is something that is imperative, right? The cost of doing it pre-disaster, again, the return on investment far outweighs the return on investment from relief and recovery. And so we just have to change our mindsets. And until we do that, I'm sure that there's got to be a place, but they're just few and far between.
Yeah, and I would just add, as you know, Reverend Barber and others in North Carolina have noted, you know, budgets are moral statements. Okay, and we can have governance that reflects true civic values. But also to add that, as we heard from, you know, our first week when we had Dr. Dello, the state climatologist, present, we're going to have more storms. Okay, so Eastern North Carolina was crippled by having 2 major hurricanes in less than 2 years. Now think for a minute, just this hurricane season in Southwest Louisiana in the Lake Charles area, having 2 Class 2 hurricanes in 6 weeks. Okay, I can't imagine the economic and just the civic and psychic trauma from recovering from 2 major storms so quickly. So we have a shared fate here, and we have got to make the investments, and we've got to make the long-term commitments to weather these storms together. Because if we don't, we're just sunk. Okay, we are seeing what will happen when civic governance breaks down under the pressures of repeated climate change traumas, whether it's from a pandemic or whether it's from racial injustice. Okay, so we've got to understand that there is an ethical undercurrent or a foundation to all this that we've got to address if we're going to move forward as a society.
Yeah, I want to add that, you know, in the research I've done, there are places that are kind of more open to it than others, and those happen to be places on the coast or places that have a history of hazards and are seeing increasing frequency and severity of hazards. You know, places like North Carolina, Florida, California, right? So they're more open to it. Oregon, you know, Washington. These are the places that will lead by example. And I think we just have to replicate their examples in more places.
Awesome. Are there any additional questions? I think we have gone through all of the questions in our chat. Okay, well, we want to thank our presenters today. Thank you for such great information and lively conversation. Thank you for all of you for participating today. And that concludes our webinar today, A Building Accessible for All. We thank you for being here and participating. We do have one more session on next Wednesday entitled A Building of Warmth and Light, Strategies to Support Rural Leaders Facing Challenging Conditions. So make sure that you tune in for that on next week. Again, we'd like to thank the sponsor of this program, the American Red Cross, for their generous support. And we encourage you again to fill out your evaluation form for today's session to be entered in to win an American Red Cross Deluxe Personal Safety Emergency Pack. A recording of today's session will be shared with you via email on Monday morning, as well as a link to the survey. Once you close out of the webinar today, you'll see the survey pop up, so you can go ahead and take that. So we hope that you all have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on next week. Thank you.